Hola, muy buenas a todos. Hoy tenemos la suerte de tener con nosotros al profesor Fukuyama, autor de esta interesante obra muy reciente. Y bueno, yo la he leído y es bastante interesante. Además, se lee de manera bastante sencilla, que se titula El liberalismo y sus desencantados. Pero bueno, antes de nada, so let me present you first of all to Mr. Francis Fukuyama. Thank you very much for being here with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
So let's go straight into the questions because we do not have that much time. As always, thank you very much, and we like to ask our guests some things about their life. So I wanted to ask you, what was the job of your parents, and what did you learn from them?
Well, that's a hard question to answer because I learned a lot of things. My father was a sociologist. He was an academic, but also a Protestant minister who worked for a long time for one of the big Protestant denominations in the United States, doing empirical research on churchgoers and ministers and that sort of thing. My mother was a potter. Um, and I would say that, I grew up in a very academic environment because my mother came from a very prominent uh, Japanese academic family. My grandfather was a very well-known economist in the early part of the 20th century in Japan. She herself came to the United States in 1949, although my father was born in the U.S. And so I suppose there was an expectation right from the beginning that I would, go on and, follow in that academic tradition.
All right. So, what do you think about the world nowadays? I mean, where we are now, do you think that democracies face a direct threat from another kind of systems or alternatives? Or do you think that the main threats come from inside our democracies?
Well, I think they're both internal and external threats. Those threats are working together. They're cooperating with one another, and so it's very hard to say which one is the more important. I mean, the external threats are pretty obvious. Today, you've got these large authoritarian countries, primarily Russia and China, but you've also got, Venezuela, Iran, North Korea, uh, that are in a kind of alliance or network. And in the case of Russia, it's deliberately attacking Ukraine, a democratic Ukraine, trying to overthrow the regime there and basically occupy the country and incorporate it into the Russian Federation. And so that's a pretty blatant uh, act of aggression of a sort that we haven't seen in Europe since 1939. Well, actually, 19 earlier than that with the German takeover of Czechoslovakia in 1938. So there's that, but there's also the rise of populist nationalist parties in many democracies. That's happened all over Europe, where there are populist parties that have grown in size and influence. And it's happened in the United States with the election of Donald Trump back in 2016. These parties are not so much anti-democratic as illiberal, meaning that they don't like the constraints that a constitutional order places on executive power, and therefore they try to undermine that order by threatening the independence of judges, of legislatures, of bureaucracies, of the media. Uh, and it's happening, around the world also, in Turkey, in India, uh, in Europe, in places like Hungary. So I think, both the internal and external threats are, very present and both dangerous.
No, but I mean, yeah, maybe North Korea or Iran, they are, yeah, a certain problem. But if we think in the long run, in 1 century or something like that, do you think that any of those offer a real alternative to to liberal democracies, or they're just minor threats, or maybe the main threats come from inside? I don't know. Just Sorry.
Well, look, it's again, it's really hard to say. Obviously, with nuclear weapons, even a small country can really cause just an unimaginable amount of damage. This wouldn't have been true 100 years ago, but today, North Korea or Iran, if they have a nuclear capability, could kill millions of people. So that's clearly something that is dangerous. But on the other hand, the undermining of democracy from the inside is actually a more immediate risk in many places, and that's also dangerous. So I'm not sure that it makes sense to say that one is more critical than the other. I think we have to pay attention to all of them.
And what about, let's say, yeah, so for those those in the audience who doesn't know necessarily your all your writings in detail, can you provide them like a fast little classification of different governance systems in the world, like dictatorships, monarchies, all that kind of stuff? So how do you see it?
Well, I think that modern government really rests on three institutional pillars. So the first is a state. A state is, the institution that gathers and uses power. Uh, the state provides services. It protects the security of populations, both internally and externally, and it enforces laws. Uh, and then the second pillar is a rule of law, which are restrictions on the power of that state. So there are constraints on state power that prevent the rulers from doing whatever they want. They have to follow the law, and the law has to apply to even the most powerful people in the system. And finally, there's democratic accountability, by which the government seeks to represent the broadest possible public interest. And I think that really the adequate working of a liberal democracy depends, first of all, on having all three of those pillars in place, but then having a certain balance where the state is strong enough to do things that are necessary, but not so strong that it can harm the rights and freedoms of their citizens. We have a lot of examples of countries that are democratic. They have elections and some degree of law, but they have a very weak state. I would think many developing countries are in that situation. I mean, you take some Latin American countries like Mexico. Mexico does not have a monopoly of force. You have these narco gangs that have taken over individual states in Mexico that act with considerable impunity, and so in that sense, the Mexican state is not strong enough to actually safeguard the security of its citizens. On the other hand, you have other countries like China, which have a very powerful modern state, but no constitutional safeguards, no checks and balances, and certainly no democratic accountability. So I think that the world has a spectrum of countries that have some combination of those three institutions, but I think that you really need all three of them in some sort of balance to have a successful liberal democracy.
Mm. And there is a very important paradox, right? If we think about certain groups like, the Muslim Brotherhood or certain far right or far left parties, that they are going to use the mechanisms of liberal democracy in order to seize power, but then they will try to destroy that liberal democracy from inside. So, how can you deal with such kind of threats?
Well, I think that you have to make judgments in each case about what the real intentions of these parties were. I'll just give you one example. Back in the Cold War, you had a lot of communist parties operating in Europe, like the French Communist Party or the Italian Communist Party. And in the heyday of the Cold War, these parties could get 20, 30% of the vote in popular elections. And a judgment was made concerning the threat that they posed. And so I think most people decided that the French Communist Party was really a Stalinist party. If they ever came to power, that would be the end of French democracy. In the Italian case, there was a little bit of debate whether the Italian Communist Party had actually accepted the basic rules of democracy. I don't know the answer to that, but I think that it requires kind of understanding the nature of these different political organizations. Same thing is true today in the Middle East, where you have groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist parties. I would say that Ennahda, the Islamist party in Tunisia, has actually been pretty supportive of Tunisian democracy. And so I don't think that they would pose a threat. In fact, they've been in a coalition government for much of the period since 2011. They're now out because Tunisia has unfortunately fallen back under authoritarian rule, but they were not a threat to democracy. Whereas the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the Islamist party in Algeria back in the 1990s, I think were not fundamentally democratic. So it really depends on these very empirical judgments about the nature of different parties, and I don't think you can generalize.
But once you do the judgment and you say, okay, this party is trying, to a certain sense, to destroy liberal democracy by using its own means, we could say,
Yeah.
how can you deal with such threats?
Well, I think that you can't be liberal if you're defending liberalism itself, and there's some times where you have to simply declare certain parties out of bounds. This happened in Ukraine before the Russian invasion. There were a number of Russian-backed TV channels that were operating in Ukraine, basically taking a pro-Moscow line, and the Ukrainian government, shut them down. They were criticized for this because, in the name of free speech, but you're talking about propaganda coming from a country that then goes about and invades you. So it seems to me that that's a case where it's perfectly legitimate. I mean, during World War II, Britain wouldn't allow Hitler to broadcast propaganda into Britain. I mean, you just don't do that when you're faced with that kind of threat to your own institutions. So I think again, that's the kind of measures that sometimes you need to take.
All right. Now, what about social media? They are really important nowadays, as we all know. How do you evaluate their impact in modern societies? Do you think that Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, their algorithms are being useful to promote democracy, or they have weakened it, or maybe they are just a secondary thing which is not that important? What do you think about them?
Well, I think the problem with those companies is that their purpose is not to promote democracy, it's to make money. And in the past, the way that they make money is by promoting content that is viral or, salacious, or in one way or another, something that people want to click on, regardless of whether that content is true or harmful or hateful or whatever. And so I think they've been blamed for the promulgation of a lot of very bad, toxic content. Over the last few years, because of the political criticisms that they've gotten, they've been trying to moderate that content by taking down, extreme right-wing, propaganda. Twitter kicked Donald Trump off of Twitter after January 6th, 2021, and that sort of thing. I think we still have a problem, though, because I don't think it's legitimate for a private profit-making company to be the guardian of political speech in a liberal democracy. And, we're seeing an example of this happening, before our eyes, as Elon Musk has bought Twitter and has let Donald Trump back on, and, has reversed some of the decisions that the previous owners made. And in a democracy, this shouldn't really be up to the marketplace. The the economic marketplace. But that's where we are now.
All right. Pretty related with this is the consensus that was previously accepted by most part of the left and right has been broken into pieces, maybe in the last decades. I wanted to know, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to know your opinion on what's going on in maybe especially far left and far right, how they are getting distanced from themselves. And, if we have a system, a democratic system who works by majorities, how can you get a majority if everything got so much atomized, so much fragmented?
Well, that's really the political problem that a lot of countries, especially my country, the United States, is facing right now. And there's not a real clear answer to that, except that you have to just do the hard work of politics. The politicians who are not extremists have to build a coalition, a centrist coalition, that will, exclude the extremists on both the left and the right. And that's oftentimes very hard to do because there is this polarization culturally. I think that one of the things that's emerged in the last couple of decades is that um, there's a sharp distinction between people that live in big cities that have higher levels of education and people that live in more rural areas or in smaller towns and villages who have very different cultural attitudes towards patriotism or family or other kinds of social values. And I think that it's hard to overcome that kind of polarization, but in a way, the elites that have been really running most countries over the last several decades really have to recognize that not everybody feels comfortable with a lot of the decisions that they've made, and they need to acknowledge that and show a little bit more respect for people that aren't like themselves.
What kind of decisions you mean for us? If you could place a few examples.
Um, well, I can think of a lot of examples around the world. A lot of it has in Europe has centered around immigration, because clearly a lot of people feel that the levels of immigration that Europe has experienced over the last 20 years are undermining the national identity of a lot of countries in terms of religion, in terms of ethnicity, and so forth. And there's a kind of elite opinion that says that, this is okay, and, these traditional forms of national identity don't really matter. Um, they're very cosmopolitan in that sense. And actually, a lot of them are kind of economists that say, well, it's more efficient to import a lot of labor because it's cheaper and everybody's going to end up, richer and better off that way. But they don't appreciate the fact that people also live in societies with certain traditions and, certain ways of looking at things. And they get very upset when those are challenged by high levels of immigration. I would say, in particular, this obviously got Europe was hit by this after the Syrian civil war in the mid 2000s. And, quite honestly, you have this situation in Europe where you have a free movement within the Schengen zone, uh, even more broadly than that, but you really don't have secure outer borders of Europe. And so a lot of people were coming into Europe, through your country, through Greece, through Italy, and therefore putting a big burden on countries in the south, whereas the policy was actually being made by northern countries that were less, vulnerable to this. So I think it's that sort of thing that's really given populism a strong voice, because people felt that this was an unfair situation.
All right. Now, this is not an easy thing to solve, but I can tell you that inside this book there's a few principles, we could say a few ways of trying to solving this problem. So if you are interested, recordad que podéis adquirirlo, os he dejado un enlace abajo en la descripción, se titula El liberalismo y sus desencantados, ¿vale? Okay, so from your point of view, now that we have this polarization, what do you think that are the most harming ideas for our systems coming from far left, mainly far left and far right? What would you think, where would you focus?
Well, on the left, the threats to liberalism have been more in the cultural sphere, canceling people that say things that are not politically correct, and a kind of intolerance of speech. I think, in the United States, at least, a lot of students think that freedom of speech is just a cloak for a kind of right-wing agenda that wants to permit, hate speech and racism and that sort of thing. And therefore, they've not been willing to defend freedom of speech, especially in universities and other, high-end cultural institutions. On the right, I think you have a clear political threat because the right is better organized and it's done better in electoral terms in recent years. And so, they came to power in the United States in 2016 and tried to do a lot of things that I think were very harmful to American government, like trying to politicize, the Justice Department and the use of, criminal prosecutions against political enemies. In a place like Hungary, the right-wing Fidesz government has really controlled the Hungarian media to a very large extent. It's made it very hard to elect opposition politicians by changing electoral districts, and so those are in a way more immediate threats to democratic practice. So I think all of these things have happened, and at the same time, there's just a kind of this was exacerbated, I think, by COVID, but a lot of resentment and unhappiness about loss of individual freedoms that are felt by people both on the on the right and the left.
All right. Now, what about the Ukraine war? Do you think that it is a very important moment for the future of liberal democracy? Is it really a key moment, or is it a secondary thing in this matter?
No, I think it's extremely important, and that has to do with Putin's motives. Putin isn't primarily upset about NATO expansion or some kind of perceived threat from Ukraine. He objects to the entire post 1991 European settlement that allowed all of the former countries that had been members of the Warsaw Pact with communist governments, that then became democratic. He doesn't like that, and he would like to reverse as much of that, especially the dissolution of the former Soviet Union. And so he's been trying to put pressure on Georgia, on Belarus, on Ukraine, to basically come back within the Russian orbit. And I think if he had succeeded in doing this, first of all, you would have seen massive human rights violations, even beyond the scale of what's already happened in Ukraine. Uh, but there would have been further challenges to the Baltic states, to Poland, to many of the countries that had been, in Russia's sphere of influence previously. And that's why I think this really was an attack against liberal democracy itself and not simply an attack on one country.
All right. And finally, now this is a YouTube channel where a wide part of the audience is related to the military. So I wonder what do you think is the role of the military in the next century? What do you think that, are they going to be like the guardians of democracy, or, what do you think about armies, generally speaking?
Well, so it's interesting what's happened because of the Ukraine war. I think that many people, and especially many Europeans, really thought that war had been abolished. And so there was a big peace dividend. Most European countries began to cut back their defense spending in the 1990s and, really didn't take seriously the possibility that they could face big external threats. And I think that the invasion of Ukraine has demonstrated that that was just wrong, that they do face this continuing threat. They've been underinvesting in their military, and they need to, pay more attention to that. NATO continues to be an extremely important alliance for protecting democracy. But I think it's also the case that we see the dangers that exist when a military does not accept a constitutional role and begins to, play a bigger role in politics. We were very worried about what would happen in Brazil because the President Bolsonaro had been a military officer. He promoted a lot of officers to political positions in his administration. And, he was constantly suggesting that the military might intervene if he didn't get, reelected president of Brazil. That fortunately did not happen. But I think that, that's a danger that, some right-wing political parties pose. And so, it's very important for militaries to understand that basic separation of their sphere from the civilian sphere, and the fact that they need to be loyal to a constitutional order and not simply to individuals. But they are going to play a much more important role because you have an external security problem that's arisen, and they're going to be central to solving that security challenge.
All right. So really, thank you very much for sharing your time with us, Mr. Fukuyama. If you could tell us what's the best thing of your latest book, what thing would it be?
Well, I think the reason I wrote it was that if you ask young people today, what is liberalism and why is it important? Liberalism, in my sense, not an economic doctrine, but really a political doctrine about rights and the importance of, the defense of individual rights through a constitutional order. People had kind of forgotten why that was critical. And, my book was an attempt to remind people why liberalism is a good thing. And, I hope that to some extent it's succeeded in that purpose.
No, for sure it does, and it is a really interesting book to read. So again, thank you very much for sharing your time with us, Mr. Fukuyama.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye bye. Bueno, pues ya lo habéis visto. Espero que la entrevista os haya resultado muy interesante. De alguna manera, bueno, se me presentó una oportunidad gracias a mi editor de Deusto, que es quien ha editado a su vez este libro, ¿no? Entonces digo, pues ya que tenemos al señor Fukuyama, pues habrá que aprovechar para a ver si se deja hacer una entrevista, y así ha sido, ¿no? Y al margen de ello, pues quiero darle las gracias también porque esta entrevista es parte de una serie de actividades programadas junto a la gente, a ver si lo digo bien, del área del Departamento de Historia del Derecho e Innovación de la Universidad Rey Juan Carlos, pero sobre todo a los profesores que en su momento pues me invitaron, que son Leandro Peñas, Erika Prado y Manuela Fernández, si no recuerdo mal, que ya sabéis que con los nombres soy un poco desastroso. Así que lo dicho, bueno, pues muchas gracias a todos por estar ahí. Espero que la entrevista os haya resultado interesante. Si la podéis compartir, pues siempre lo agradezco. Por lo demás, lo dicho, tenéis el enlace abajo en la descripción. Muchísimas gracias a todos por estar ahí y hasta otra.